Good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Today, we are honored to have with us one of the finest actresses in the English-speaking world, Ms. Juliet Stevenson. She trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. She was a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company for 8 years. She was nominated for the British version of the Oscar, that's the Olivier Award, 5 times and won once for Death and The Maiden. She has had the CBE conferred upon her, that's the Commander of the Order of the British Empire, for the many services that she has rendered to the theater. And with that quick introduction, let's plunge right in. Could you tell us something about the very worst experience you ever lived through on stage?
Oh, wow, Dick. The worst experience on stage was, I think the worst one is stage fright. So I've been working for 45 years, and I think for about 30 of those years, at first, I didn't know what stage fright was. And then it began. Then I had a very, very bad experience with a director on a show at the National Theatre. She was quite a bully, and I felt sort of my confidence drained away. And the next time I tried to go back to the theatre, I found that this sort of stage fright had set in like a sort of low-level virus. And it gradually increased and increased over the next job or two in the theatre until it was sort of paralyzing. And I thought I wouldn't be able to go back on stage again, which would have been for me the worst possible thing. Because if I had to do one thing only, you know, out of filming or audiobooks or theatre, it would always be theatre. So I mean, there's nothing worse than stage fright, because you're out on stage feeling that you are completely subconscious. You're watching yourself from a height. It's a bit like people talk about out of the body experiences. You know, you're shaking, you're sweating, you're terrified that you're sort of going to be shown up. You don't believe anything you're saying or doing. You think the audience can see all of that. It's like sort of being naked. It's like a sort of nightmare when you think, you know, one of those nightmares you have when I don't know, you're stark naked in a public place or something like that. You know, it's very irrational, and it's very, very terrifying. So it took me a while to find solutions to that, but happily I did. And I don't think it will be a problem again. I think once you've had it, you know. But yeah.
You know, when Bette Davis first went out to Hollywood in the 1930s, her studio asked her to assist in some sort of test that they were doing. So she showed up assuming, you know, that she'd be running lines with some actors, and of course there'd be a camera there. And when the moment came, there was no camera, there was no running of lines, there was a big brown couch in the center of the room, and whoever was in charge of this program asked her to simply lie on the couch, which she did. And Miss Davis, while a giant figure on screen in real life, you know, was a very small, petite person. And for the next 30 minutes or so, 15 different male actors actually laid on top of her on this couch. I mean, I can't imagine what it was that the studio was trying to find out. And so while I'm confident that actresses today would never have to endure a situation like that, can you talk a little bit about some of the injustices that women in theater and film are still confronting today?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, I think that historically, I mean, that's a very extreme story and a horrendous story for her. I think historically, actresses have always been very vulnerable to that dynamic in the room. You know, historically, directors have tended always to be men. When I first joined the Royal Shakespeare Company, there were 12 men who were associate directors at the company. There were no women directors, and those men were all white, as it happens. And I started campaigning. This was when I was 20. You know, I was there between the age of 20 and 29. And most of those years I was campaigning for them to invite some women directors in, not because they're going to be better, but just because it was important to me that we had sometimes a woman's perspective on those plays. Those plays, after all, are about men and women. So I think, I mean, historically, theatre has tended to be run by men, you know, directors have been tended to be men, writers, the vast majority of writers are men, and so on. So it's felt like a place where you have to fight quite hard for equality. And we know that fight is continuing. It's much, much, much better. But there's no question that there is still a hiatus for women actors, for example, that, I mean, I'm now 67. I've been working since I was 20. When I was young, I was very lucky, and I played lots of huge roles in the classics and in new plays. And then you get to about 40 years old, and there is this plateau. There are no more roles in Shakespeare or in the classics, almost none. And the men are continuing, you know, they go from Romeo to, you know, Henry V to Macbeth to Henry IV to, you know, there's no, they don't have to stop. There's no pause in the trajectory of their careers, as it were. Age does not stop them at all. There are always roles for men of every age, but for women, there really are not. And it's getting better because there are more women writing. There are more women who's writing on screens. There are more women producing and directing, but still a minority. In this country, 7% of film directors are women. 7%. So that's still a pretty, you know, dismal statistic. And I mean, it's not that only women are going to make stories about women, and not at all. But I think obviously, so I think it's and the problem is, of course, that the reason there aren't roles for women is that middle-aged women are not considered to be of any sexual interest or beautiful anymore, or therefore have much value in any, or nobody's really interested in their narratives. Whereas in fact, I think, you know, my experience as you get older and older, life gets more and more interesting. You have more and more experience, more and more perception. You have the confidence of what you know. You have the confidence to make judgments. You've had, you know, lots more things have happened to you. You've had a whole lot of life to process and come to terms with and understand. And so there's so much more to give and to use in your work as an actor. And yet, ironically, the parts get smaller and more two-dimensional and less interesting. So I'm lucky because I have had great roles, and but even I am quite often in a situation where I think, oh, you know, this is so. You're there to support the man, the male protagonist, who has the story.
You know, interestingly, one of the things that I saw written about you when I was doing some research is that because, in the opinion of this reviewer, you're a bright, open, engaging presence on both stage and in film, that you were, in his opinion, often diverted to playing wives and mothers, as opposed to, you know, some of the other parts that you might have played. So I thought that was an interesting.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to ask you if, when you had applied at RADA, if they had rejected you, would that have been the end of your career before it even began?
Nick, these are great questions. Do you know what? I never thought of that. I never, ever thought of that question. But I think, let me think back. Probably, because I mean, you know, nobody in my family had ever been anywhere near this industry, this profession. And, you know, to ask in the 1970s to say you're thinking of being an actress, it was a bit like saying I'm thinking of being an astronaut. I mean, you know, we just don't, it wasn't likely. And none of my friends, and, you know, I did quite well at school. So me and my friends were all heading for university. And my teachers and my family had said, well, listen, if you love theatre, you know, why don't you consider reading English and drama at university? Then you'll, you know, be able to sustain your interest in theatre by reading drama alongside English. So I thought, yeah, that seems good. And I found a wonderful course at Bristol University, which was a joint honours course in English and drama. And they took a really small number of people. And I pitched myself at getting a place there. And I very luckily did get a place there. And on the face of it, that was all great. And then I accepted the place. I left school. And I literally had a kind of light bulb moment, one of those epiphany moments that perhaps your audience will relate to. I woke up one morning in a cold sweat and I thought, what am I doing? Why am I going to university to study this subject? I don't want to study this subject. It's not academic for me. It's in the body. You know, I want to act. Acting is a completely non-intellectual, non-academic. It's about inhabiting someone. It's about completely imagining what it is to be someone else. It's the last thing it is in your, you know, the front brain. And so I don't want to end up with a drama degree and end up teaching drama in some school. That's a great profession, but it's not one I want to be doing. So I privately, the only place I'd heard of was RADA. It was the only drama school I'd heard of. So I wrote off and said, you know, how do I audition? And they wrote back saying, you prepare one piece of Shakespeare and one piece of modern. So I chose them. I had no idea what I was doing, really. And I did it on my own. My eldest brother drove me up and I walked into the audition. I was completely intimidated. There were loads of other people there auditioning. And the system was that they auditioned everybody in the morning and then they made a short list of people they wanted to see again. And then those people auditioned for the head of RADA, the principal, in the afternoon. And a measure of how much I thought I wasn't going to get in was when they read out a list, and with my name on it, I just assumed that was a list of people they wanted to let go. So I left the building, got my coat, I walked out the building, and it was only because the guy on the front desk came running down the street after me. He literally did. He said, oh, Juliet, where do you think you're going? And he said, you are not allowed to leave. And I honestly thought he'd made a mistake. So then I auditioned for the principal in the afternoon. And when the place, I was just so sure I wasn't going to get in that I just assumed. So when the place came, suddenly it was as though, you know, that moment when you're turning a camera lens and everything goes from blurry to sharp focus. As soon as that letter came saying, we're happy to offer you a place, like the whole of my life kind of went into sharp focus. And it was absolutely clear that's what I wanted to do. And I threw the university place away, that very precious university. But if the letter had come saying, I'm sorry, you were not lucky, you know, I would have absolutely not tried anywhere else. I would have gone to university and I wouldn't have kept on trying like some people. I know many people, very successful actors, who went on and on and on trying and got in on their 5th attempt or their 6th attempt. You know, or they tried every other drama school in the country. I don't think I would have done that simply because I didn't know anything. I didn't know, you know. So, yeah, but happily I didn't have to make the choice. I mean, I'm sure I would have had it, you know, very interesting. You know, there are times when I think, what would have happened if I, you know, got myself an education? And there are times when I think that, but I think I was very, very lucky, really. It was just all about hunch and instinct. And that's why I say to kids now, you know, just follow your deep instinct in terms of what you want to do. Always listen to that voice. It's a more important voice than the voice of even the most well-meaning teachers, probably.
I wanted to follow up by asking about something that happened to you while you were at RADA. There was an episode where you were very harshly criticized by one of the instructors in a way that was unfair and destructive, and it represented sort of a turning point based on what I've read. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, and it's another great question because so in my first term I arrived aged 18 and I was extremely insecure. I didn't really know who I was. I was barely out of childhood, and of course the first thing you have to do at drama school is use yourself, you know, using your own person in the work, because we are our own tools. That's quite difficult to do when you're very young and you don't know who you are. So I enjoyed the music, the singing classes, the physical movement classes, the voice classes, the text classes. But when it came to rehearsing plays, I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea. So I wasn't very good and I was very insecure, and most of the other students seemed to have much more confidence than I did. And then we got to the second term And in the second term, they were giving us our first Shakespeare, and it was Antony and Cleopatra. But Cleopatra was considered too mature and too large a role to give to one student. So it was divided into three, between three of us girls. And the section of Cleopatra I was given was the one in which a messenger comes to tell her from Rome that Antony, her beloved Antony, has married Caesar's sister. And she goes into an absolutely towering rage. And she beats this servant up and hurls abuse at him, and all her servants are running around trying to stop her, and she's screaming at everybody, and she's absolutely brokenhearted and raging. And obviously, you know, at me, age 18, you know, with a little side parting, and I hadn't got a clue how to play this extraordinary woman with all her sexuality and all her anger, and I couldn't begin to do that. And I was obviously driving the director crazy. And at one point he stopped the rehearsal and he said, Juliet, and all my peer group, all the other students were sort of sitting and standing around the edge of the room. And he said, this is pathetic, you know, this is meaningless. You have nothing, you are nobody, you know, this little virginal, weak, he completely sort of destroyed me. And I just stood in the middle of the room. They were allowed to do this stuff then. There was no consciousness about protecting the student or anything. And he was known for his toughness. He was also very brilliant, but he was also known to be ruthless if he didn't like you, and he obviously didn't like you. So I stood in the middle of the room, and it was like, I was just burning up with embarrassment and horror, and I could feel I was going to burst into tears. And I thought, okay, I'll just run out of the room, and then I'll leave RADA, and then I'll go back to university. I'll just give this all up. It was a stupid idea. And then I thought, oh, I suppose I could just collapse on the floor and pretend to faint or something, then somebody will take me out. And then suddenly I filled up with anger. I suddenly felt so angry that this guy, who I was very intimidated by, but I felt so angry that he felt entitled to say these things, to do these things. I felt so angry that this was happening in front of all my peer group. And I don't think I'd allowed myself to feel that kind of anger before, but I was full of it, raging with it. And then he said, anyway, let's have one more go at this scene. And we started the scene again. And that anger I was feeling suddenly poured itself into the language that Cleopatra has. You know, all her language is rage and fury and brokenheartedness. And that's what I was feeling. And suddenly that language, instead of sort of sitting very uncomfortably in my mouth, suddenly it was the only thing I wanted to say was what she had to say. And I could feel that what I felt was going into what she felt, and it was going into the language Shakespeare's given her. And I could feel it was like jumping out of a plane. It was like free fall. It was completely exhilarating. And I suddenly, as it was happening, I thought, this is it. This is what acting is. This is what it is. It's all about using everything that's you and pouring that into the person you're playing. And then I knew that the room was going quiet, and I knew that it was having a huge impact. I could feel it, you know. So, and at the end, he said, well, that's better. That's better. Thank you. That's better. And why this story is interesting is because I never went back from that point. I mean, that was not a lesson that I ever unlearned. I knew then. It was like, you can't unknow it. When you know it, you can't unknow it. It's forgive me, but it's a bit like losing your virginity or something. You know, it's like you cannot go back from that point. And I mean, confidence can waver and it can get better or worse, but you're never going to go back past that point. And the reason I think the story is interesting is it's not that I would suggest that teachers are entitled to behave that way regularly, but I do really, really worry about this now, the culture, which is kid-gloving students and everything's student-led, and students make the decisions and they can fire their teachers if they don't approve of them. And you think, I'm sorry, I really don't agree with that. I think a degree of toughness is absolutely essential. All the best teachers I had, all the best directors and instructors had a degree of toughness. I never got anywhere being wrapped in cotton wool or kid-gloved. Of course not, because you know, you need people to make demands of you, and then you either meet those demands or you don't. And if you don't, you shouldn't really be in the industry anyway. So while you need encouragement, you also need some tough love. And that's why I think the whole culture now, whereby if anybody feels, you know, they've been had a demand made of them, they're going kind of complaining to the principal that, you know, this is some outrageous infringement of their rights. And I think, you know, that's very questionable.
I have to ask you, I think that while, you know, your style and appearance is completely different, you are very much like Betty Davis in one way. And I think that has to do with giving everything you've got, putting every ounce of you, you know, into a role or a part, and thinking about the fact that the Shakespeare plays that the public knows best, they're long, they're very demanding, both physically and psychologically. And in the theater, you know, of course, the key is to do it night after night after night.
Yeah.
And thinking about you giving everything you've got, what does it cost you, and how can you continue to do it?
I mean, it does cost a lot, but I'm not, you know, working in an emergency ward at a hospital dealing with people who've, you know, stabbed each other and shot each other in the face. I mean, you know, we do it is demanding because you're using yourself, you're using your heart, your soul, your brain, your body. But, you know, there are many people in the world who do much, much tougher jobs. I can't imagine how anybody goes into a school at 8 o'clock in the morning and teaches, you know, 30 kids who don't want to be there, or who goes in to operate surgery in the morning. You know, and I mean, there are so many jobs, I just can't imagine how people manage to do them. And I think when it's not your job, it always seems incredibly difficult. But I think I love that. In a way, the more challenging it is, the more I love it. Because I think there's something about, and that gets more and more as I get older, because you've done so many things and you want to keep having challenges made. And the danger of getting older as an actor is that those challenges stop, because you know how to do a lot of stuff. You've got a lot of skill, you've got a lot of craft. You know how to play a huge theater, a small theater. You know how to work in a small screen, or you know how to work in the difference between cinema and television. You know how to, you know, you've got the tools, you've got your craft. And it's so easy for actors as they get older to sort of sit back on what they know, and it's all quite easy for them to do it, and they just play the same version pretty much of themselves. And I'm terrified of that. I'm really terrified of becoming boring. So I'm always looking for ways in which those challenges keep coming, and I'm scared and I don't know how to do it. And that can't be every job, is not going to be that kind of challenge, but that's what I'm always looking for. So I think the bigger the role, the more demanding, the better. It's like if, you know, if your listeners today understand what it's like to do, I don't know, to run a marathon, or, you know, or to go to the gym and do a really big workout, or I don't know, to walk all day on some beautiful mountain, or to swim for, you know, I don't know. I think anything which uses all of you up, you know, and is an intense experience is so rewarding. You do get exhausted. I'm often exhausted in the morning, but you know, then you pick up energy during the day, and then it all goes into that show in the evening. There are times when I am, you know, when you do twice a day, that's tough. And as you rightly said, the biggest challenge of all is the repetition. I mean, the repetition is sometimes something which makes you feel crazy. You know, I can't bear that I have to go out on stage and pretend none of this has ever happened before. You know, I know this play inside out, and we've done in 80 performances, and I've still got to go out there tonight, Tuesday or whatever, and pretend none of it's ever happened and not know what you're going to say. But that's the job. And so you have to be absolutely in the present moment out there. If you're even an inch ahead anticipating, or if you're looking back at what's just happened, you have to be just in the moment, you know, as you do when perhaps you're playing a piano, or when you're, you know, many things require you to be in the moment, and that's the only way you can be on stage. And if you are absolutely in the moment, then it doesn't matter how many times you do it, it will always come to you fresh. The main thing you should do on a stage is listen to the others. Forget about yourself. Listen to the others. Because if you're listening to the others, listening to that actor and that actor, it'll come fresh to you. Not acting listening, really listening. And then it will come to you fresh every night, hopefully.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, you're also a mother, but nobody ever talks about that. And of course, your children are grown now. But I wanted to ask, how difficult is it to raise normal, healthy, well-balanced children when mom is a star?
my children should probably answer that one. They're very funny about me sometimes. Because there are times, you know, when you're rehearsing a role in the theatre, when you can't help sort of becoming a bit like the person you're playing. Definitely, I definitely become, you know, accrue a little bit of the character you're working on. You bring them home with you at the end of the rehearsal, and you bring them home with you a little bit after the. And sometimes I think, oh God, here she goes. You know, she's turning into Hedda Gabler, or, but I think for me, having children was an absolutely essential thing. I just always wanted to have children, and I also was a sort of actor who really, really needed that counterbalance. I mean, if I hadn't had anything to counterbalance the profession, if I'd only ever just been acting, many leading actors don't have children. You know, I've got wonderful friends who decided not to do that and very much focused on their careers. And I don't think I would have managed that. I think it would have driven me insane, the industry. I love acting, but I do not love the industry. I do not love gatherings of the industry. I do not love awards dues or first nights or red carpets, or I'm hopeless. I mean, I go with a good grace, I hope, but I don't like it. I don't enjoy them. And I feel unsafe, and I don't think the profession is at its best when it's all gathering in one room. I love actors when we're working together and we're having a great conversation with them in a cafe or something. I do not love them. I do not love our industry when it's all gathered together. It's sort of self-congratulatory or bitchy, or I'm scared of it. So I think for me, having children and going to the local school and turning up at 8:30 with them every morning and being there when they got home, or shopping for food in the local supermarket. I mean, I loved all that ordinariness. I loved the ordinariness of it. I craved it. And when I had it, when I was just another school mum at the school gate, chatting to other mums, or when I was going to parent-teacher meetings, or when I was, you know, taking them to ballet or tennis, or, you know, all those normal, ordinary things. I've always really loved that, Dick. I had a very abnormal childhood as well. So I think maybe in a way it was a combination of things. And I think for me, that very ordinary domestic life also offset the work, the intensity of the work, the craziness of the work, the insecurity of the work. I'd come home and there were these, you know, I've got a very wonderful husband and these gorgeous children and extended family who I love. And that's always been like a real sort of safe place, and sort of balancing. And you know, you've got a sick child. It doesn't matter what your career is doing. If you've got a sick child, the sick child is what matters, not your career. And I think that's so good. You know, it's like it's a leveling thing. I think the actors are often in danger of taking, you know, getting a bit too excited about themselves. And we just sometimes need to remind ourselves that, you know, to have other people who are more important in your framework is vital. It is so important, I think.
I hope you'll forgive me for bringing up Madly, Truly, Deeply, but I mean, I really couldn't interview you without talking about that. And in preparing for this, one of the interesting things that I've discovered is that I don't think anybody who's seen that film has ever forgotten it. And it strikes me that in less capable, talented hands, that would have been an awful movie, in the sense that it's such an invitation to bad, over-the-top acting. But in terms of what you and the late Alan Rickman were able to do, you know, as I remember it, everything felt right. Everything felt true. I mean, it's like the best calibration of emotions that I can ever recall seeing on screen. How did you do that?
Wow, that's such a wonderful thing to say. Well, I mean, I totally agree with you in the sense that you're right. It could have been quite sentimental, and it could have been. I mean, there's some people who don't like it. You know, I have heard people who don't like it saying they think it's sort of whimsical, but I think Anthony Minghella, who wrote it and directed it, the late great Anthony, I think he knew that he had written something obviously quite fanciful, you know, ghosts coming back from the dead and sleeping all over the floor and watching movies all night and getting too hot, or turning the heat, you know, all those sort of rather crazy, funny ideas that if you were going to write that stuff, again, you had to counterweight it with grief had to be huge and real and jagged and ugly. There was nothing there was no question of it being, you know, like a glamorous tear rolling down a cheek. The way grief is conveyed on screen has long sort of frustrated me, because I think everybody who's known grief and loss, or even depression, you know, knows that it's not elegant, it's not glamorous at all. When you're in grief, when you're desperately missing someone you love, you feel terrible. You don't care what you look like. You lose, you know, you stop dressing well. You often, you know, don't take care of yourself. You feel awful. You hate everybody else because they're all not in grief, or, you know, everybody's got their husbands or wives or children. You don't feel all those things necessarily, but it's an ugly, dark, difficult, lonely place, and it's not glamorous. And I think that the sort of glamorous, elegant tear rolling down a cheek that you often see, you know, that doesn't even smudge the makeup, that whole sort of expression of grief on screens is something both Auntie and we talked about, and said, I think she should be absolutely wild with it. You know, she should be snot pouring, you know, hair all over the place, hasn't washed for a week. You know, that's the sort of grief I want to convey, because that's what people need to see. They need to be able to identify and think, yeah, that's how bad I feel. You know, that's how angry I was, or that's how sad or desperate or hopeless I felt. And so that was the deal, really. So that was my job, you know, was to try and do that, and give that sort of weight to her grief, so that then, in counterbalance, the rest of the film could have its delicious sort of silly, daft humor, and the honeymoon period between them, when they're just being kind of crazy and loony in the flat and the apartment and all that, was counterweighted by that huge grief at the beginning.
I have to ask you, you know, when you look at Britain or the United Kingdom on a map, I mean, I'm always struck by how small it appears, particularly compared to, you know, so many other nations and cultures. And I wanted to ask you, what is it about Britain as a culture, as a society, that has led, you know, Britain to becoming the home of the best actors in the world? And I think any honest person would admit that.
Well, it's a really interesting point, Dick, but I'm not sure I agree with you. See, I mean, when people ask me who my acting heroes are, I always think, you know, Meryl Streep, Leonardo DiCaprio. You know, your film actors, your great film actors are consummate. I mean, for me, if you know, for me, Meryl Streep's the goddess, because she transforms completely from role to role, and she is that person. You put all Meryl Streep's roles, line them up. I mean, she just is those people. There's no, you don't say, oh, there's Meryl Streep playing that, and Meryl Streep. Whereas our great actors, very often they're very similar in whatever they're doing. They're just, you know, I don't want to name names because it's indiscreet, but I think you have some sensationally brilliant film actors, and I think that I think we have a very deep, long, old sort of stage tradition, which maybe means that people do. There's a difference here culturally, which is very significant too, which is that you don't have to be a theatre actor or a film actor here. You do everything. It's not like, you know, West Coast Hollywood is screen, East Coast, New York, etc., is theatre. You just do everything here. I go from film to TV to theatre to radio to theatre again to film. I mean, that's so. And I think the reason, the significance of that is that you can feed one thing into another. For my money, you can't start working in film and hope to really become a great actor. I mean, Meryl Streep started in theatre. Most of your great actors started in theatre, and that's where the craft is learnt. That's the apprenticeship, you know. And if you can be credible and wonderful on stage, then you'll be fine on film, because you learn all the tools there. Anybody can go into a film and be filmed, actually, in the way they're edited. If they're edited carefully, they'll look fine. They'll be able to, you can edit a performance from somebody who's not giving one. I've seen it happen. I've made films or television series with actors who really don't seem to be able to act at all. And the way they're filmed and edited, it's a perfectly good performance at the end of it. That's absolutely not possible on stage. You know, the stage is a great litmus test. You know, you have to sustain a whole life on stage from the beginning to the end. And so I think that maybe the fact that we are constantly going from theatre, maybe that's an advantage we have, whereas in a lot of people in the States now are, you know, if you want to be a screen actor, you have to go west and you have to make your way. But that means you're not really going to have that sort of apprenticeship in theatre where you learn your craft. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do hear you, and I do think we do produce some wonderful actors, and I don't know whether it's something to do with the fact that the Brits are, you know, culturally and historically quite repressed. You know, everything happens under a lid. You know, there's a lid on British culture. There's a lid on, people do not express themselves. They don't often say what they mean. I've often struggled living in this country. I wasn't brought up here, and I feel much easier. I was in New York for 3 months in the summer, and I felt much more at home there, because in New York, people say what they think, like me. I mean, you know, I'm a bit more of an extrovert. I don't really, I can't play the game very well. I'm not very good at codes. I just tend to say what I think and feel. And here that can be a big problem in England. It can be too much, or people need more boundaries. They like things to be subtext rather than text. They like, you know, they like to keep that lid down. And maybe that keeping the lid down means there's a lot going on under the lid. And so if you're an actor and you choose to take that lid off, there's an enormous amount to come out. Do you see what I mean? I'm just hazarding guesses now, culturally, why that might be. Or maybe there's, you know, there's always suggestion of depths, you know, there's sort of hidden depths when you're an English actor walks onto a stage, because they are, I don't know really. I'm just freewheeling here, but maybe that's something to do with it culturally. But you've got amazing actors. You have.
You think that British and American audiences are different in any significant way, different expectations?
I can't speak for screen really. I just took this play to New York for 3 months, which I had played in the West End here, and it was a very different audience experience. It was a play called The Doctor, which was about a lot of contemporary issues. So it was about faith, religion, including Catholicism, abortion. It was about identity, race, gender, transgender. It was about cancel culture. It was about a lot of things that people are very occupied and preoccupied with at the moment. And so there was a lot for audiences to respond to, and a lot for the company, the actors, to be dealing with and juggling. I found in America that the New York audiences, anyway, responded far more vocally to things in the play. So they understood that my character was Jewish, and she's subject to anti-Semitism at certain points in the play, although she doesn't particularly wish to engage with that. But that was a much more vocal, vivid response in New York than it ever had been in London. The abortion issue in New York often used to get rounds of applause when my character would sort of argue why abortion, for example, was because of Roe versus Wade and so on. So there was I think audiences in America, and my experience of New York, which is my only experience, were much more willing to sort of vocalize and make their presence felt in the auditorium, which I love. Less shy, perhaps, yeah. Otherwise, I don't know. On the other hand, I went to see a couple of shows in New York before I opened myself, when I had some evenings free, which were huge hits, which had garnered with Tony nominations and things. And I didn't take to them at all. So I thought, well, that's interesting, because if people love this and have sort of loaded it with Tony Award nominations, I feel very alien from that. I didn't particularly like those pieces of theatre that were very, very acclaimed. So, but I mean, that can also happen in London. And that was because they were very issue related. They were very obviously about gender and class and things in a very obvious way, in a very declared way. And for me, theatre really isn't that, it's not a sort of place where we issues where we talk, I mean, there are qualities and there are aspects of the human condition that are going to arise again and again and again, but actually to sort of make theatre which is polemical is not my cup of tea so much.
I wanted, that's a great segue, because I wanted to ask you something about British theater and film in the 50s, this period of, I guess they were called kitchen sink dramas, and I guess the voice of the angry young man was finally heard in the land. And boy, at the time, it was very exciting. Do you think that any of those works will still matter 50 years from now?
Another great question. I mean, I think if you're particularly talking about Look Back in Anger by John Osborne, that the importance of that play was that it sort of booted upper middle class theatre out of the window and said, no, for too long, theatre's been owned by Terence Rattigan and Noel Coward, although Noel Coward, as we know, had a completely impoverished working class childhood, but he identified as posh, and that's how he developed his person. But I think it was true that and Granville Barker and all those famous writers in British theatre who had dominated the first part of the century were representing very middle class values, and all those plays, although brilliant, were set in very moneyed drawing rooms and sitting rooms and living rooms of those very comfortably off, and they were looking, whereas what John Osborne, that play exploded onto the British stage at the Royal Court, and it was saying, it was full of class anger, and class anger was so of that time. I mean, I think finally after the war, a grateful Britain who had been led to victory by Winston Churchill immediately booted him out after the war. That you were fine for the war, but for peace we want. So we want a left-wing Labour government, but it's the time the people had their war contribution recognized. It's time we looked towards more equality. It's time we looked at, quite rightly. And so I think theatre very quickly kicked in there too. And it was a class issue. And in my belief, this country is so riddled with class. Class is such a deep part of England's identity. It's in everything. So they were very, very important plays. But if you look at them now, they're extremely misogynistic. I mean, that Look Back in Anger is full of horrible misogyny. And as I remember it, the only character who's allowed that voice is the young man, and the woman, Alison, his wife, is ironing. There couldn't be a more sort of cliched stereotype for a woman. And he abuses her and her. And I mean, I think generally John Osborne is quite a misogynist. So I think that the plays will struggle to. They may be there of historical interest, but I don't think they will be performed in the same way that some of Shakespeare's plays are also problematic. I mean, Taming of the Shrew, in my view, is full of misogyny, and it's extremely difficult to do it now because our relationship to women has, hopefully, society's relationship to women has changed, and you can't make a comedy out of a woman being beaten up and subjected, to such discipline by a husband and find that funny. I don't think, the Merchant of Venice has anti-Semitism in it, which you can't. It's extremely problematic, I think, The Merchant of Venice. And that's just because history has overtaken it and we can't look at it in the same light anymore. So I'm not sure about those 50s plays. I think the plays of Beckett will certainly survive. They are works of complete genius and they sort of supersede their era and other people. But I think it will, I don't think necessarily John Osborne will last.
I wanted to ask you, we live in a time when there's a lot of controversy, a lot of confusion about facts. What is factually true as opposed to what people believe? And I was thinking about that because you've been in a wonderful play where, and I might add, I guess, played both roles where over time you've been both Queen Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, I guess frequently determined by a coin toss, if I understand
exactly
correctly. So there's part of me that understands immediately why the idea of a confrontation between those two queens is so appealing dramatically, and why the audience is really just primed for it to happen. But given that we're in such a state of confusion about what's true and what's not true, should a theater program note in a situation like that the two women never actually met?
It probably would say that, wouldn't it? I mean, most theatre programs have interesting articles in them. Certainly we do. I don't know whether this is true in the States, but in the theatre here, they're always, you buy your theatre program, I think you get it free. I mean, they were in New York, the programs were handed out free, but here you pay quite a lot for your program, maybe £5 or £10. And you'll get some very interesting articles in it. And there's bound to be an article in Mary Stuart about how they never met in real life. But I think the theatre has the absolute, that is the right and the privilege of any artist to say, okay, I'm taking history and I'm going to do what I want with it. I am not a custodian of objective truths. This is not empirical. This is this is the world of the imagination, like painting or novel writing or poetry or filmmaking, or, that's our prerogative, is that we take stories and then we do what we want with them. And it's not because we are historians. We're not delivering history lectures, or we're not teaching children history. We don't have an obligation. We are interpreting life, and any interpretation is going to be subjective by the writer and then the director and then the actors, and so we're going to be in a world that's not about empirical truths. You would want, however, very much there to be a part of your world which was reliably true, and you would want that from your news and your current affairs and the way history was being recorded in your time. And the fact that now, the news we receive is interpreted, and we only seek the news from forums or platforms which we already agree with is I think a devastating direction for us to have moved in. Because what theatre hopefully at its best is doing is saying, look, this is not you. You're watching a play, say Macbeth. You come to watch Macbeth. You're watching somebody who's killing people to get to the top. You're never going to be doing that. But I invite you in to explore what it is that makes somebody do that. And before you judge him, just try to understand what's driving him and his wife and his cousin. And, let's try to understand the people on the stage, not judge them. And that's what theatre's for, really. It's sort of what great film and TV are for too. Let's be entertained by them, and you can obviously going to like some people and not others. But the main invitation is to understand human nature. And that's about tolerance and about understanding the other and understanding how other people tick who are not you. And that's what's disappearing from our culture so desperately, I think, at the moment. And it's so frightening. And the idea that, you couldn't play an Irish person if you're not an Irish person, or you can't play a Jewish person if you're not a Jewish actor. I mean, I have a real problem with that, because my job is about imagining what it's like. I could play you, Dick,
God forbid.
Actors should be able, if you look at, Meryl Streep's not, look at the roles she's played. She's played everything from every class, And each of those journeys of hers have been a journey into finding out what makes that woman tick, that poor woman with 2 kids and no husband who's trying to survive, got a job in a nuclear plant or whatever, whatever she's playing. That's my love of the work. So I think we do. And after all, Shakespeare took history and completely interpreted it in the way he wanted to. He decided to look at Richard III and make him into an out-and-out villain. There's lots now coming up in history to say he wasn't that sort of pantomime villain that we like to think he was. He was a much more complex, nuanced person. But Shakespeare is taking the story and doing what he wants with it. And I think that's fine in the theatre, because everybody knows they're not in a library or a museum.
Do we have some... So we have some good questions for you, so I'm going to turn Adam loose to read them.
And let me ask Karen Schwartz's question first, which is very relevant to what you were just saying. Can you imagine ever playing King Lear like Glenda Jackson did on stage?
Oh, I mean, totally. It's an extraordinary question that you've asked me, because what really made me want to act, probably. I think I probably did when I was younger, but when I was 15, I was at very, very boring school. And but into my school hall one morning came a bunch of actors from the local theatre, and they just wore t-shirts and jeans, and they did a cut down version of King Lear. Only 5 of them, I think, 5 or 6 of them, doubling up parts and no costumes. They just did the play in the school hall, and it was like 11 in the morning or something. And it was one of those occasions where I walked in one, as one person, and I walked out, 2 hours later as another person. I was completely blown away, and by the play, but also by the character of King Lear. And I didn't want to play Goneril or Regan or Cordelia. I wanted to play King Lear. And I was obsessed with it. And then about a year later, at 16 years old, I was taken to Stratford for the first time, and I saw Richard II. And again, I went home wanting to play Richard II. And on that summer, I remember locking myself in my room, and I learned most of the role of Richard II. I still know chunks of it. Because I wanted to play him. And it wasn't about wanting to be a boy or a man or change gender. It was nothing to do with that. It was the scale of what they were given to say. King Lear is raging about it not being fair. Nobody loves him enough. Nobody's letting him have what he wants. He's getting really frustrated. People are being mean to him. I mean, all those are things that teenagers are constantly shouting about. So if you think about it, I often think, why was a 15-year-old girl, in the south of England so identify with this, raging old monarch? Because actually what he is saying is, it's not fair. You don't love me enough, and I want to do what I want to do, and you're not letting me. And that's exactly what a teenager is constantly saying to their parents. But he says it with such dignity and with such huge metaphors, and it's such incredible. The language is full of such power and meaning. And so I recognized him. So yeah, I used to say the part I want to play is King Lear. And that was before any woman had played it. I used to say that. When they said, what do you want to play next? I'd say King Lear. And then Catherine Hunter did play King Lear here. And then Glenda played King Lear here. So I don't think I will be playing King Lear. But I don't really need to anymore. But the only thing I would say is I'm not that particularly interested in playing men's roles anymore. I think I want to tell women's stories. It's a great role, but it's a man's version, and it's a man's reality. And I think I'm all for gender swapping when it's relevant and when it's a choice rather than just random. But I think I personally want to tell women's stories.
Thank you. You've also fantastically anticipated our final question from Susan Weber. Do you have a favorite literary character that you've always aspired to depict on either stage or screen?
Oh, that's so good. Well, probably one of my favorite ever is Maggie Tulliver. I don't know whether any of you know George Eliot. Have you read any George Eliot?
Yeah.
The Mill on the Floss. I think my favorite character in all literature is Maggie Tulliver in The Mill on the Floss, because I relate to her very strongly. She wants things so badly, and but she kind of gets incredibly worked up about it, and she very often doesn't get them. And she's just the most. I love that character so much, but of course, there's no chance of playing her now. I wanted very much to play Margaret in Howard's End, which was one of my favorite novels too. And I did meet James Ivory. It was an Ivory Merchant film, but in the end, it went to Emma Thompson. So very often the things I really most wanted to play, I think I want them so badly that you can't conduct an interview very sensibly because you want it too much.
Okay.
I would have loved to play Dorothea, I think, in Middlemarch. But no, I can't really think of anyone in the contemporary world. No.
Well, Ms. Stevenson, I want to thank you so much. I mean, this was fascinating, just incredible on so many different levels. It's been such a great pleasure to have you. Certainly one of the high points of my life and career here. So thank you so much for your kindness and hanging in there with us through all the steps and uncertainty.
No, thank you for hanging in there. It was me that delayed with my stupid health collapse thing in New York, and you've been so patient, Dick, and all of you. So I'm so glad we made it work in the end, and thank you all so much for your patience and for having me. It's been really, really lovely to meet you at last. Yeah.
On that wonderful note, I think we're going to call it a day. So
Okay.
thank you so much.
Goodbye to you all. Bye bye.